art is a live thing. Like, it's a buying and selling, it's a marketplace, but it's also a global community. And some of the great outcomes of fairs aren't just the commercial outcomes. They're the new leads that were generated, the new contacts and connections, and that's really powerful.
Hey everyone, on this week's episode, I'm joined in the studio by the CEO of Art Basel, Noah Horowitz. An art historian with a background in economics, Noah previously worked at Sotheby's, served as Art Basel's Director of Americas from 2015 to 2021, and was the executive director of the Armory Show in New York for several years before that. His 3-decade-long journey in the art world has also included stints at the Serpentine Gallery in London and as the director of the VIP Art Fair, the first ever online-only fair. He holds a PhD in art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and is the author of the 2011 book Art of the Deal, Contemporary Art in a Global Financial Market, a relevant as ever text that we talk about at length on this episode. I wanted to have Noah on the show for several reasons, most of all because he's a rare CEO, the kind of creative leader who brings a well-rounded view to all that he does at the helm of one of the world's most important international art organizations. His approach is grounded in both a rigorous understanding of the art market, which is to say the makers, buyers, and sellers of art, and the art world, comprising all of the extended stakeholders who are involved in producing, exhibiting, viewing, and discussing art. Noah is one of the most astute minds when it comes to understanding the relationship between art and money, and as you'll hear, he takes quite a long view on the subject. For him, though, his interest in money is really, at its heart, not so much about money itself, but about the idea of value and how it's created. And naturally, given his post and background, he's a tireless advocate and enthusiast for all things art, from artists and galleries to collectors and institutions. On the episode, among other things, we get into his ambitious agenda to grow Art Basel as a year-round cultural catalyzer and into realms far beyond what would traditionally be considered the art world. The centuries-old history that, in a roundabout way, helped lead to and continues to inform and shape today's art market, and the 55-year-old evolution of Art Basel, from its tight-knit origins in Basel, Switzerland in 1970 to its global platform today, with the debut this week of the Art Basel Awards at Art Basel Miami Beach and the launch early next year of Art Basel Qatar. Before we get into the episode, I'd first like to thank our Season 12 presenting sponsor, the high jewelry maison Van Cleef & Arpels, which this year is collaborating with the American Museum of Natural History in New York to present the exhibition Cosmic Splendor, jewelry from the collections of Van Cleef & Arpels, an awe-inspiring assemblage of jewelry creations, timepieces, and precious objects with astronomical references from the Maison's patrimonial collection, as well as from private loans. From dramatic necklaces depicting rockets in flight, to gem-encrusted pendants inspired by distant nebulae, to watches with intricate mechanisms that trace the transit of planetary bodies. Cosmic Splendor features nearly 70 astrological, celestial, and mythological creations that celebrate the wonders and mysteries of the cosmos. Among the enchanting universe of pieces on display are a yellow gold and ruby moon pendant from 1969 that's a celebration of the Apollo 11 moon landing, a yellow gold zodiac bracelet from 1973, and 2021 double galaxies clips, characterized by their evocative swirling designs. These works trace the stylistic evolution and the level of expertise that the high jewelry maison, founded in Paris's Place Vendôme in 1906, has developed throughout its history. You can purchase admission tickets or learn more about Cosmic Splendor at amnh.org/exhibitions. That's amnh.org/exhibitions. And now, here's my conversation with Noah. Hi, Noah. Welcome to Time Sensitive.
Hey, Spencer. How are you?
Doing well. Really excited to have you here in the studio today. And we're recording this interview on November 10th, 2025, which I guess in Art Basel time means it's a few weeks before the 23rd edition of Art Basel Miami Beach and just 2 weeks after the 4th edition of Paris Plus. You're also gearing
Art
up.
Basel Paris officially.
Oh,
now,
it's Art
Spencer.
Basel Paris. Sorry, no more Paris Plus.
2 years in the Grand Palais changes
yes,
everything.
Exactly. And you're now gearing up for the premiere of Art Basel Qatar, which will launch in February of next year. So what's your take on Art Basel time? How are you feeling at this moment in time?
Yeah, so I joined the business minus a hiatus at Sotheby's, but I've been back in this role as CEO for 3 years, but I've been with the business effectively for 10 years. And in the beginning, there were 3 fairs, and there was Basel, the mothership in June, and in Miami, which is really not only the fair that I led, but the fair that I started coming to very early on. I didn't go to the first edition, but I was living in London and grew up here, and it started in 2003, so I'd come back and pretty regularly, or rather, it started in 2002. I started attending it in 2003, but regularly attend that, and then we had Hong Kong. But now with 4 and in the first quarter next year, 5 fairs, there's really no downtime anymore. I actually went straight from Paris 2 weeks ago to Doha for the Qatar Museums, Qatar Creates Week, celebrating 20 years of Qatar Museums. And I'm back there already again next week for the Fashion Trust Arabia Gala and all the stuff that Her Excellency Sheikh Al Mayasa and the museum complex is doing out there. It's extraordinary. So time is warp speed now, Spencer. But we always make sure to take pauses along the way and continuously recalibrate.
Yeah, I mean, there is a certain slowness embedded in Art Basel somehow. I think we could make a case for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we're in Brooklyn right now, which isn't far from your home. This is home base, but how often are you actually here?
So I'm on the road about half the time.
Okay.
So I lead our business globally out of New York. We have an office of about 20 or so here downtown, which I opened about 10 years ago, principally to service the Miami fair, but we work globally. So a lot of our colleagues in New York are servicing the business on a global basis. I'm in Basel every 4 to 6 weeks. I actually fly out this evening to Zurich, and we'll spend the rest of the week in Basel before coming back on the weekends. So it's always switched on, but it's nice to be with you in your extraordinary studio here because it's a Frida Escobedo project, right?
Yes, and this is where I reveal to the listeners, this is the first time we're recording in this new studio. It sounds good. It sounds good in here. Yeah, it's warm.
And I met Frida. I've kind of crisscrossed him, and I'm a huge fan of her work. We actually had dinner in Paris 2 weeks ago, and we're seated opposite each other. I mean, she's just a complete force. So it's really awesome to see and be inside a new building of hers, pretty much in my own backyard in Brooklyn here.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to mention here, which I enjoyed in researching for this episode, was that you've described Art Basel as a tight staccato of productions, which sounds operatic, and I really like that. There's maybe the idea of art world opera. Could you?
I like that as well immensely, actually. It is somewhat orchestral. I mean, we often compare the selection process for admission into the fairs as tightening an orchestra, right? So you need to get all the notes in order. And different galleries, different projects, different artists all play different notes. And as we expand as a business and deliver more and more during these 4 and very soon 5 times a year, but also come to life outside of those moments as well, that tight staccato is totally on point. And it's something that we're very focused on in terms of everything we do, every place that people and our audiences and clients, have touch points with Art Basel need to be best in class. And one advantage to the insanity of delivering 5 events, the caliber that we deliver, and I think that for those that were fortunate enough to be in Paris in the Grand Palais a few weeks ago, really saw that in extraordinary form, is to debrief and to ask ourselves searching questions at each of these moments coming out of these events, and then tighten and adjust for the next event and the next thing that we do after that. And so that's a bit chaotic from a management standpoint. It's a lot, but it's actually awesome because it means that we're learning more times a year than we used to. When I started in this business, in the art fair business, in the bricks and mortar side of the art fair business, running the Armory show all those years ago, you'd have this event in March and then just like fades away. And then you've come together again a year after. And now with Art Basel, there's really no downtime any longer. And one of our goals is to be more and more present continuously 365 through our media, through our editorial channels, through other events we're running. Also during the Paris Week, we published with UBS the latest survey of global collecting. We're going to be rolling out the first edition of the Art Basel Awards, gold medalist ceremony in Miami, which is a whole new crescendo to that show week. So, there's a lot more coming across the platform now than there ever has been. And we are learning from different audience segments, different ways of delivering our business and brand than we ever have before.
I mean, it's so much more than an art fair. How would you define Art Basel? Like what would be a way of describing it? Because I think to many of our listeners know what it is. Many of them attend Art Basel or have attended Art Basel. But it's evolved so much since 1970, since it was this very selective, tight-knit fair in Basel, Switzerland.
Yeah.
Now it's something much, much larger.
Yeah, so I think there's a few ways to think through this. First of all, we see ourselves as a leading cultural brand. And in doing that, the foremost objective is to continuously deliver for our gallery clients, for the artists that they represent, that they work with, but also for collecting communities, professional communities the world over. And we have a mindset of continuously advancing opportunities or being an opportunity accelerator for the art world or the world of art writ large, right? This idea that we don't directly, although increasingly more and more we're commissioning more things, but for a lot of what comes through the Art Basel platform, we don't directly create it, but it comes through Art Basel and then it accelerates and explodes from there, and more opportunities, whether commercially in terms of market making, but also in terms of advancing artist careers and creating more touch points for the global community of art. If you go back to the beginning in 1970 when Art Basel was founded by Ernst Beiler and Trudy Bruckner and a few others in Basel, Switzerland, it wasn't the first art fair of its kind. Art Cologne famously was a few years ahead of it. But very quickly, because of Beiler's imprimatur, it became a really important event. But even through the 70s into the 80s and 90s, there was Art Basel, there was Art Chicago, there were other regional fairs or media-specific fairs. It wasn't really until Miami where in the early 2000s, Art Basel went from being basically like a trade fair for the trade to this event. So the second chapter in many ways with Art Basel was the Art Fair Week, and taking the apparatus of three walls, lights, and our art fair booth and expanding it into a program of VIP events and film programming and music and all of this stuff that became synonymous with an art fair week. And whilst we did that and continue to do that, it's also been copied ad infinitum by other fairs and cultural get-togethers. I think with the addition of Hong Kong, Art Basel really expanded globally in a different way in terms of bringing the evolution of new opportunities, not just for the Western art world principally, but for a global art world. And that's continued with Paris, which adds a different element within the European context. But interestingly, nowadays, it's the most globally diverse of our fairs, as some of attendance and some of the ebbs and flows of the business, perversely have actually become more regionalized. And of course, with our foray into Qatar next year, that pushes the envelope even further into the MENA region, but also, creating touch points to Central Asia, to Africa, so on and so forth. To your broader query about what Art Basel is, the reality is most people recognize the name, like, what's Art Basel? Like, it's cool. I've heard of it. I've been there.
Yeah, it's an imprimatur kind of. It's like a stamp, right? Like
it's a stamp of something. I don't presuppose that actually most people actually know what Art Basel is. And I introduced you not long ago to our colleague, John Nichols, who is a consultant and now the Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer of the business. And we've been working with John and his consultancy over the last 18 months to do a lot of insights and really listening to our audiences. And in surveying a lot of collecting, but also art-interested audiences around Art Basel. One of the key takeaways was that the brand recognition of Art Basel is like off the charts, like 80 to 85% of people that were surveyed globally, that we created these touch points with, knew Art Basel, like it was familiar to them. But when you actually ask them what Art Basel is, like that number, the funnel drops to like 25 or 30%. So there's this extremely high brand recognition, but actually pretty little operational understanding of what Art Basel is. And that's a huge opportunity for us, right? So one of the things that we're very focused on now as a global brand is really correcting that name recognition thing, like really being much more intentional and clear about what Art Basel is as more and more people follow us through our social media channels, as they read about Art Basel, as they talk to friends or family, or create touch points with people that come to Art Basel, but really try to very clearly message out to them what Art Basel is. I think even professionals within the trade get it, but many people that buy things that come to Art Basel show weeks, they don't even know where Art Basel begins and ends. Like in the American context, we're speaking in New York, like my broader network outside of the art world, like they come to Basel in Miami. First of all, they don't even know that Basel has a heritage in Switzerland, many. And when they say Basel, it's synonymous with this extraordinary week of culture and goings on in Miami, but many don't realize or even clearly recognize the role we play in the business that we run, which is, in the Miami Beach Convention Center and environments in the program. And there's a lot of opportunity in that disconnect. And that's one thing that we're very focused on, really, really focused on driving business to the great galleries, artists that come across our platform. I'm absolutely, hell-bent on correcting perceptions around Art Basel's read in the market. I mean, on the one hand, Art Basel stands for excellence, and it has to. And the apex of a lot of that, of course, is, seeing these extraordinary gems and masterpieces, from the Western canon, but increasingly from throughout the world, whether the extraordinary Basquiat's or, some extraordinary Modigliani's and Richter's and, in the 8-figure price point. But price isn't in itself a measure of greatness, as I know and as I certainly know. And really good art and conceptual and aesthetic and structural sort of contributions to the discourse around art are really what matters. And it's important for our audiences to know that these things aren't synonymous. And, we hope, and I hope as the CEO of the business, that art-loving audiences are able to come across Art Basel and really genuinely get curious down into the detail of what our clients bring and what artists do across the platform. And that covers an infinitely wide spectrum of price points and touch points and access.
Right. I mean, I like that you described it in a certain sense as an incubator or accelerator, kind of both. And there's something that's interesting that happens with time at an art fair. I feel like since we're time sensitive here, we should be talking a little bit about this. And probably no one better in the world to speak to about this than you. How do you think about what happens temporally within a fair itself? Because I do think that there's sort of this condensed version of marketplace and reality that occurs within the walls of the Messeplatz or the Miami Beach Convention Center.
Yeah, I mean, I love time as a precept. And I think Art Basel, as a real marker of where the market is, has this ability to both put its thumb on whatever's hot, what's in the moment, but also given, how far we stretch our wings and the depth of what one can experience in coming to an Art Basel fair, time also slows down. The great joy that I have and my team knows that I take this opportunity is putting my headphones on and walking through the halls of the show very early on the mornings we open by myself, checking out everything that our galleries bring, peeking into the closet, seeing the works that are sort of tucked away. The fair as a beating mechanism has the ability to flex and adjust. And it's a bit of a choose your own adventure. So if you're looking for, the hottest and most interesting conceptual artist or best painter in Berlin or LA, in all likelihood, you'll see that. And you'll see the best examples of their work at Art Basel. But there are often also, and it's beautiful that there are these moments for reflection, rediscovery. I mean, increasingly in the market today, especially coming out of the cycle we've just churned through as the market rebalances and recorrects. There's, some artists, as always in every cycle, that have been in the center of view and commanding extraordinary prices in the primary and secondary market. Not all of them will make it. But there are others that will be repositioned along the way. Discoveries, the trajectory around female surrealism, for example. Speaking of Frida, especially in the Mexican canon, is extraordinary right now, or the Latin American canon broadly. But there's, artists from Southeast Asia that are being discovered and setting, side by side against, the Western greats. I think that's beautiful. In Paris, there were a number of these parallel streams running through with, a number of seminal works of Picasso from 1907, 1908, like that Demoiselle d'Avignon period, works on the booth of Acavella, like a 1908 masterpiece, and at Pace, a 1907 masterpiece. And these are, works that are millions or tens of millions of dollars. But then at the same time, there's like upstairs in Paris, Martine Aboukaya did a beautiful conceptual project with Robert Barry with like literally nothing in it. It was sort of repositioning of his inert gas series from, the late 60s, early 70s, or Takeishi, who is like the master, like Japanese gallerist, and I know you love Japan, did a solo presentation on the main floor, like in the nave of Paris, maybe 100 meters from where, the biggest blue chip galleries are sort of dueling, and, had a solo show of Rei Naito, right? And Rei Naito is, the famous Teshima Museum is part of the Naoshima complex, and it's awesome. It's just like
water droplets.
Water droplets. There were two balloons, like Felix Gonzalez Torres's clock. There was a little plant in a glass jar that I saw this guy, like it was the opening day of the fair, and I see this gallery assistant like dropping a water beaker into it because the artwork only became an artwork when the water was totally leveled at the top. And then the drawings, there were drawings or maybe paintings or work on paper, they were like diptychs. And they were absolutely unphotographable. Like you couldn't possibly document them. And as a testament to like slowing down time and the insane frenzy of like an opening day of an Art Basel fair, it was like this beautiful sort of kiss to what great art can be, but also what Art Basel as a platform can be, where you are able to see these artists side by side, and the price differences and striation couldn't be more jarring as well.
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our season 12 presenting sponsor, the high jewelry maison Van Cleef & Arpels, which this year is collaborating with the American Museum of Natural History in New York to present the exhibition Cosmic Splendor, jewelry from the collections of Van Cleef & Arpels, an awe-inspiring assemblage of dozens of jewelry creations, timepieces, and precious objects with astronomical references. Featuring nearly 70 celestial, mythological, and astrological jewelry creations that celebrate the wonders and mysteries of the cosmos, the exhibition presents an enchanting universe of jewelry from the Maison's patrimonial collection, as well as contemporary creations, some of them on loan from private collections. You can purchase admission tickets or learn more about Cosmic Splendor at amnh.org/exhibitions. That's amnh.org/exhibitions. And now, back to the episode. Putting us back in this moment in time that we're in right now, heading into 2026, I wanted to bring up here that next year marks 15 years since the publication of your book, The Art of the Deal, which is not to be confused with Donald Trump's.
It's Art of the Deal. There's no "the" in the front, Spencer.
Okay, sorry.
You can't copyright a title. I needed to put Art Center in that title.
Yeah, exactly. Art Center. And I feel like this book, which was your doctoral thesis from the Courtauld Institute in London, or came out of it, has become this seminal text over 15 years. Maybe you wouldn't say that, but I think it's okay for me to say that. Rereading it to prepare for this episode infinitely showed me why. Like, there's so many things that you write in that text that I feel like have only become more true with time in a way. And I'll just quote from page 153 of the paperback edition here. You write, art's intrinsic value makes it especially attractive during periods of high inflation, as well as the notion that interest in art can rise during periods of financial and political turmoil. Art as a reserve of unassailable meaning in difficult times. So it's very relevant for this time that we're in. Like, I feel like art is basically something we cling to when there's a lot of unknown being thrown at us.
Yeah, and I think that that's as true now as it was then. I think in the paperback edition, or maybe it was the original one, I think I did an afterword that was published after the fact. But, the book was written and brought to print right during the great financial crisis. And it opens with Damien Hirst's sale. And
the day Lehman Brothers collapsed, basically.
Yeah, totally. And it's not for nothing that framing brings us up to the present, where you have Catalan's golden toilet as the centerpiece of Sotheby's entree into the Met Breuer, or the Breuer, sorry. Yeah. Still says Met Breuer, by the way, in Uber when you want to try to get there. Sotheby's doesn't exist on Madison Avenue. So somehow that is a reflection or a reminder that, and I stand by this. I mentioned at the time, the book itself charts art's role as an asset or investment, which as a subject I exhausted and got a little bored of just looking at how paintings performed at auction. But if you go to the beginning of professionalized interest around art as an asset class, the beginning of that really is the rupture of the 1970s and 70s stagflation. And the British Rail Pension Fund in the UK, as part of the pensioners, at least an allocation of their pension, they allocated to fine art and created the first structured investment vehicle for riding out, these waves. And it ultimately performed quite well. That as a sort of throwback into where we are now is important, because in all of these cycles, like the 70s, again with the 80s boom bust and the rise of, the impressionist market and Japanese speculation, and you then get to the 90s, which really is the bedrock of the moment that we inhabit now. So many of the names, the galleries, the artists that have come to define today's moment all came of age then, and many of them were put on the map through, the soft market of the 90s. The 90s was a pretty tough market environment. A lot of galleries went bust. The market in a post-Berlin Wall era was becoming more global, but it was still very, it was still New York, London. Berlin was just becoming a thing. And, I firmly believe that through that moment and this moment now, great art can get made, it will get made in response to these moments of great change. If you look at Rikrit Tiravanesia's early pad thai
which you write about so beautifully in the book.
It's and Rikrit's he's everywhere. In Doha 2 weeks ago with Qatar Museums, he was the celebrated artist du jour doing the big evening performance at the IMP Museum. So that was my grounding. And it's just interesting how, especially at a moment where the commercial market it's a little bit softer, and I'm not comparing 2025 to 1990. It's very different. The market's infinitely more global. There's more wealth than there's ever been. Even if the market's been sideways or down for 2 years, the baseline is so much higher than it was 30 odd years ago. But at the same time, conceptual experimentation, that jostling, that playing back. I mentioned Ray Naito's these balloons in this project, is indexically pointing back to Felix Gonzalez Torres, who, is undoubtedly one of my favorite artists, and I think one of the great artists of our time. These moments of possibility are all there. And I think, this hopefully is also one such moment where, it's imperative that the commercial structures are there and that more opportunities are created at a baseline commercial level. But, as a moment of real creativity, I have extremely high hopes for the art that, will be created in the next years coming out of, what can only be defined as a pretty wild geopolitical moment.
When I think we get so stuck in thinking about the now that we forget, this sort of history you're talking about from recent decades or even centuries past. And in your book, you lay out this sort of great overtime arc of how we got to where the art market is today. Or at least where it was a decade ago, I guess still where it is today. And I thought we'd maybe just bring that up because it's so interesting. You're bringing this track back to like the 17th century, the 18th century, where there was already a development of forms of patronage, primarily in the sort of royal sense of the term, but it evolved. Could you talk a little bit about that from your art historical perspective? What you can recall.
I can reflect on it a little bit. I mean, I think, art has always been defined by money. Let's be clear about that. Even going back into like chapel or, commissions, and
maybe even cave paintings. Who knows?
Cave paintings. It's always about money, patronage, access to expensive materials, and this color blue, and so on and so forth. That all is real. Interesting. I got to Paris a few weeks ago via Amsterdam. I was there for a day and managed to pop into the Rijksmuseum, and in the Northern Renaissance, certainly in the Dutch context, there was a real civic, bourgeois sort of lean in around art. Like it wasn't just the ultra wealthy. It was something that was lived in a more accessible way than just being papal commissions or state-run things by different kings and queens. And I think that currency is really important for art to be lived as a society, for people to feel that they have access to these things. And, these cycles come through. And I think bringing that up to now, I mean, there's a lot of discussion in the market around resale royalties and artist agency, especially coming out of the latest market boom. But if you look at the beginnings of those conversations, even in the 20th century context, it all goes back to the early 20th century, at the time in like the 19-teens when the first discussions of the droit de suite and artist resale royalties were a market started cascading for the first time in a commercial sense, in terms of the trade, in the early 20th century Parisian avant-garde. And so these things are, in my mind, fascinating. And I think if you look back in time, you can find a lot of indexical points to how, our current environs are opening up. And the other thing I'd say on this is a student of history in terms of market cycles. One thing that's always been the case is, as markets ebb and flow, there are pretty much two or three consistent themes. One, when one market bottoms out, the next is usually propelled forward by new audiences and new types of content, right? That's always been the case. So whether it was, the rise of the American avant-garde coming out of post-war Europe, in the mid-century, or I was, with a friend who's an auction executive last week talking about, being at Christie's in the early 2000s and mid-2000s when the idea of post-war and contemporary art was like blasphemy. And all of a sudden, very quickly, sales of post-war and contemporary art eclipsed modern and impressionist art.
Yeah, the YBAs,
Yeah, and it was like, didn't seem possible. And I think, now we're in this moment as well where you have a global pull, but you're bringing in different voices, whether that's like Cause or, whomever, Murakami, obviously, like, the Dodgers just won the World Series and immediately it flips to like Murakami's, new project with LA Dodgers. Or if you were in Paris with Louis Vuitton, in the halls of the Grand Palais, this giant crazy octopus. So there's a lot that's happening all at once. And what it's created is a more striated version of culture. Where all these things can exist somehow side by side, and we can all apply our own value lens to what we prefer or whatnot. But it's really interesting.
And just looking at the last 25 years, I mean, why do you think the art fair has so proliferated, I guess? What is it about this particular relatively short period of time?
It delivered what the market was looking for. Again, as a student of history, the 90s were the biennial decade, right? Like after the wall fell, there were biennials everywhere. The Johannesburg biennial, the Berlin biennial, the Whitney biennial, like every city had to have a biennial.
Yeah, it was like the Bilbao effect, but for the art world, right?
Totally. And, turns out people want to buy things. And the art fair became, the pace of business generally became more event-driven. Also at auction, by the way, it's not just an art fair, the private market side. Art fairs delivered what the market was looking for. And these extraordinary weeks on the calendar where collectors, but communities, it's also a reminder, Spencer, that art is a live thing. Like it's a buying and selling, it's a marketplace, but it's also a global community. And some of the great outcomes of fairs aren't just the commercial outcomes, like how much something's sold for or how much a gallery sold or whatnot. They're the new leads that were generated, the new contacts and connections. And that's really powerful.
I have one of my best friendships in the world to thank Art Basel, actually.
Fantastic.
I met this person at Art Basel Miami Beach, and they are one of my closest friends.
Yeah. Well, we were at a wedding with some friends that will remain unnamed in New York in September, and they met, in Basel. And like the wedding, all the wedding speeches, it was like Basel propaganda. It was extraordinary. But it's a beautiful reminder of the power of culture. This is lived culture. This isn't a petri dish. This this isn't a scientific experiment. Like people come to these platforms because they genuinely want to be there. Like we do not, as a business, pay celebrities to endorse Art Basel. That's just not what we do.
Yeah.
We create the possibility for extraordinary things to happen. And it just so happens that people of a certain influence or cultural intrigue genuinely want to be there of their own accord. And that's the most powerful endorsement of the brand and of a platform than you can get.
It's the sort of heart, the core, the center of, if we're just talking in the case of Miami at least, like the core of what happens there. There's a lot of ancillary things that happen around the fair that have nothing to do with the fair.
Yeah, but they all create something that's more. And I think in the end, like we're all stretched, for time.
Yeah.
We're stretched for resources. New York is the greatest cultural capital in the world, but to properly see what's going on in the New York cultural landscape, or just like the fine art landscape, you've got to dedicate days of time, and then every 4 to 6 weeks as the exhibitions turn over, recalibrate that. And that takes time. It takes focus. It takes time on your weekends or your evenings to go to those things. An art fair delivers that in bite size.
Hyperspeed
and
also, right?
Hyperspeed in a very, very consolidated way. Like one of my really good friends who bought a new apartment recently reached out and said, hey, like I've got this much to spend, what should I do? And I gave him a checklist of like 15 galleries to see in London or New York. And then I kind of kid myself. I just said, actually, like, what are you doing in December? Did you just come to Miami for 2 days for Basel? Because actually it's way more efficient for you and your time. And you'll see in the Miami Beach conventions, you see 250, 300 galleries. You'll meet people in the real, you'll meet artists. Like it's actually just as a consumer, it's a more efficient way of going about one's business.
This is what I was talking about with time. It's like that scene in Star Wars where, the screen kind of just like goes into hyperspeed, right? Like that's sort of what it feels like to go to Art Basel for a few days.
Yeah, it can. And again, our great hope, just to be very clear on this matter, is like our gallery clients need to build sustainable businesses that work without Art Basel. Let's be very clear. And that's super important. But Art Basel as a fair, as a platform, should help accelerate, sort of further perpetuate and grow that base. And increasingly, in a world where buying and selling is more modulated and it's more event focused, we recognize that these moments as calls to action become that much more important. It's very hard to sell things in the private market. Auctions work because there's 100 things that are going to be sold. You have a sense of what the pricing is based on the estimates that are set. And if you don't bid now, like it's gone. And the private market needs that. And Art Basel as a platform has, created this extraordinarily well-oiled, recall to generate that on behalf of the global market. And we do it now, with more audiences and more constituents the world over.
Let's get personal. I wanted to go into your background here, growing up in Princeton, New Jersey. And I know you were interested in art at a young age, primarily through film and music. Is that right? What are some of your earliest art memories?
Yeah, look, I grew up, in an upper middle class household. My dad was a doctor. We had a loving family, but we had no toe in the art world to speak of at all. But as a suburban kid in the 80s and 90s, we had music, we had film. I was a huge Tarantino junkie. And I grew up in Princeton, which is not, the most culturally forward of towns, but it did have the Princeton Record Exchange. It still does.
And there's the Princeton University Art Museum.
Which has just gotten rebooted, but I didn't, I'll be honest, I didn't have great
2.0,
experiences.
2.0 now.
I still need to go. I mean, that is, quite a new contribution to civic culture in Princeton. But the Record Exchange is the place. If you ever want to go in any place in the world and feel like a tiny pea, go into the Record Exchange and talk to the guy behind the desk about what's cool in the music world, and that guy will put you in your place really, really quickly. And that was my reference. I, would listen to Ween or Fish. I remember De La Soul's 3 Feet High and Rising. It was the first album I memorized end to end. Maybe through some of that, I have very distinct memories going to the Philadelphia Museum of Art as a kid on school trips or with my family, seeing the Brancusis and the Duchamps, just kind of querying what that was. I remember, going to the Institute for Advanced Study and finding the rhombus, Tony Smith's rhombus, this sculpture in the woods, and it was a reference point, music culture, but it was a thing, and you'd go climb on it. It was wow. But I never ever thought that I would develop a career doing this stuff. But then life happens. I went to the University of Virginia. I was just down in Charlottesville, actually, this past weekend. I just joined the board of the Fralin, the art museum there, which is quite cool. And I got into the honors program at UVA. I was an econ major. I declared that quickly. But I took a lot of classes in art, foreign affairs, finance, and I just had this interest in alternative investing, the value of culture. I was a summer analyst my last summer at Goldman Sachs, in the media and research team. I figured that was a thing to do. That's what, many students of my generation were pursuing as a career. And I was a summer analyst the summer of 2001. 9/11 happened, and lo and behold, didn't have a job offer and had to rethink, pivot. And I had two great advisors at UVA. One was Howard Singerman, who's really important arts educator. Another was a professor in the commerce school. They had a great business school and a undergrad commerce school at UVA. And, they said, hey, have you ever heard of this place called the Courtauld in London? There's a great, political economist there, a guy called Julian Stallabras, who had just written High Art Light and was gaining some notoriety. High Art Light was the great takedown of the YBAs. And I'd never heard of the Courtauld, never heard of Julian. I applied and ended up getting a scholarship. And so I moved to London, 1 year doing a master's degree turned into this I wonder what the deal is with investing in art. And I spent
This is right as Art Basel Miami Beach is starting.
This would have been the beginning. I was in London starting in the fall of 2002. So that's Miami was supposed to be December of 2001. It was delayed due to some combination of 9/11 and anthrax, actually. So it's pushed back a year. As I said, I didn't go to the first Miami, but I did go to the first Freeze, which, Freeze started in Regent's Park the fall of 2003. And I spent the next years exhausting any bit of literature on, around
art and money.
On art money, the econometrics of art. So every study, and I just started meeting people. I didn't know anything. I just followed my instinct, which was to get into the field and talk to people. And as I started calibrating, I started meeting artists and curators and some gallerists. And
you worked for the Serpentine Gallery, right?
Well, I met Hans-Ulrich Obrist via Liam Gillick, actually, who I had interviewed. And Liam invited me to Munich to come to the, Utopia Station, which was this thing that started at Venice Biennial. And they did the second iteration at the Haus der Kunst when, Chris Derkon was there. And I remember meeting Oakwe and Wieser and Hans Ulrich, and we're speaking in an interview. And this is one of my great stories is, the story to end all stories was I had this 6:30 meeting with Hans Ulrich. And that's when he...
In the morning.
Yeah, of course.
Brutally early morning.
Yeah, there was brutally earlies and there were hyper earlies. I actually don't remember whether brutally early club or hyper early club was earlier than the other, but they were hellishly early. And the time I was given was 6:30, and we went to this cafe. And I took out this recording technology on my laptop to record my interview with Hans. And he was so sort of envious and jealous of this recording technology. We just talked about the recording technology for the hour allocated, and we never got to do the interview. So then he invited me back the next day, and I recorded my interview with him. And, what ended up happening was this just kind of beautiful thing. He was at the Musée d'Art Moderne, and he started giving me transcriptions and stuff, that today you just throw an AI bot. But that's how I started. And I started transcribing Hans's interviews with all these extraordinary people he speaks to. And when he moved to London to take the Serpentine gig, he reached out, and I was like a summer exhibition assistant on this American group show. And that was the beginning.
You describe it as a hurricane world of friends, ideas, and energy for art, and it is. I mean, there's this like palpable whirlwind around Hans Ulrich, and I can imagine that must have been so informative for your work. It's like an entree into this medley that is the art world, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, look, like Hans Ulrich is, he talks about hurricanes and, but he really, when you're with him and that you feel very important. It feels like he has this extraordinary ability to make the people around him feel like they're the center of the world.
And everything's urgent.
And everything is super urgent. One of the funniest voicemails I've ever received, and it's a shame that it fell off my phone, was during the first of these Serpentine marathons when Hans and Rem Koolhaas stayed up all night to, this was probably summer of 2006 or 7 when Rem had his Serpentine Pavilion. They did this like 24-hour conversation marathon. And I worked late into the night and then went home because we divided, I was a staff member and everybody got divided into 4 6-hour shifts. And at like 3 a.m, I received this frantic voicemail from Hans's assistant saying that there was a fruit emergency and that Hans and Rem needed like a very specific type of fruit in the middle of the night. And it was absolutely priceless. But yes, it was a frenzied scene. I think before getting to Hanzo, in terms of like going back to the beginning, because it kind of goes back to Princeton in a funny way, it was that moment between finishing at Virginia and moving to London that really cemented my chosen path. It was the summer of 2002, I guess, and I was leaving university and I decided I was going to stay at home for the summer and I didn't know what I was going to do. And I reached out to Kirk Varnado, who was chief curator of painting and sculpture for many years at the Modern and had taken a post. He had cancer, so it was a very sad, emotional moment for him. And he'd taken a post at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And I reached out to him cold and I just said, hey, I live in the area and I'm going to the Courtauld and, I don't know, it'd be nice to meet. And he invited me for lunch and ended up giving me a job working as a research assistant. He was preparing the Mellon lectures at the National Gallery in D.C.
Which I found this out about you in researching for this, and I watched a few of those lectures.
Oh, wow.
And I have to say, there's 4 of them, and they're like a masterclass in abstract art. It's really, to all the listeners interested in abstract art, go watch these. We'll link to them in the transcript.
You should link to them, and they became a book called The Pictures of Nothing. Kirk was one of the more inspiring people I ever met, one of the great orators and lecturers on art and the potential of art, why artists and art is just important. He gave me the confidence or like the kind of line of sight to somehow see that this was a thing that you could build a career around and that this was what I was going to do. Up until then, I had like no idea. And then meeting Hans Ulrich and entering his universe a number of years later accelerated that. But I think Kirk really, like if there's one person that you could kind of point to that kind of gave you the internal confidence to know you could do this, it really came through that summer and, the next year working together. And then he delivered his lectures and very shortly thereafter passed away. And it's a real touching chapter in my life.
Yeah. Well, I just imagine the research on those lectures, the transcribing of Hans Ulrich's interviews. That right there is an education unto itself. I didn't know anything, right? Like he would just be like, go find this article. And I'd go spend like 2 days in a stack somewhere and try to find it. And then I'd, read a little bit. I have no idea what it was about. And somewhere at home, I think I still have all the dossiers that I prepared for him. I think also worth mentioning that when you started working on what became Art of the Deal, it really, and there still is to some extent, but there was much more opaqueness around art and money. And I feel like your book does this, really powerful thing, which is to show this link, not just in historical terms, but also like through an art world lens. Like it's not just like an economics, like as you were saying earlier, it's not like these are the auction sales, this is the economics of it. There's a whole culture and a social aspect to value here.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, look, I was speaking just last week actually to a financially literate audience, let's say, folks about the state of the market. And somebody came up to me after and said, hey, said, I use the appendix of your book to map out, somebody that's starting an art investment fund of some sort. And they didn't know the history of these funds and where this stuff really came from. So
Jeffrey Deitch co-founding a Citibank
totally
art advisory.
Yeah, extraordinary, right? And that's how, Jeffrey began. And there's a whole network and world of people around Jeffrey, including our colleague Stephanie Reed in Miami, who's been with Art Basel since the late 90s. And if I recall correctly, she met her husband or then husband Evan through Jeffrey's world. So again, there are material and concrete things, but there's a lived world of culture that, that we're all a part of. Some of that is art investment specific, but a lot of that is day to day. And it's not for nothing, like Olav Velthaus, his Talking Prices was really like the kind of bedrock of, he was a PhD sociologist, if I recall correctly. But, his book, which inspired a lot of my writing, was really about, the signals and coding of value creation in the art market. And one of the things that Olav talks about is just the familial nature of artists, gallery, collector relationships. And you just continue to see that lived out, and it is absolutely timeless.
Yeah.
That it's a financial instrument, of course. It's an asset, if you want to call that. But in the end, it's a social good.
It's probably one of the most beautiful, enjoyable financial instruments too, if you frame it that way. And just thinking about the literature that's been written on this, you also quote and reference in your book Richard Rush's Art as an Investment from 1961, Gerald Reitlinger's The Economics of Taste, which was published in 3 volumes between 1961 and 1970. There were predecessors that led to your book. I'm not saying your book was the first, but certainly it's interesting that this literature now, I think, has become more understood in the world of art.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that that's important. Again, we're all paddling in the same direction. So Reitlinger was the famous, I think he was an economic historian, but basically, he's the one that gathered all the pricing archives from the 17th century forward. Or John Michael Montius was a professor and did all that sort of heavy lifting work on the Dutch North, the Northern Renaissance in Amsterdam. And you have, all these other guys. And now fast forwarding to present, you've got We Do Our Part, and it's something that I'm, very involved with and really believe in with Claire McAndrew and UBS, the Global Art Market Report and the Surveys of Global Collecting. But, there's a lot of other analytics out there now. And I think that that's great. I think one of the impediments to the art market, if I say so directly, are just these artificial boundaries. And, when we look at the world and how people are consuming culture today, I think that, transparency is really important. And as we press outward beyond, and, we're in a moment of extraordinary shifts in collecting and patronage generally, where some of the old guard that really put the market on the map are aging out. Some of them are passing away. Their children aren't necessarily collecting with the same fervor, but more than making up for that is, a younger, more global world of collectors is very female driven. And many are coming to our world through different spheres of influence and through, gaining their wealth in different ways. And they're trying to query what they're buying, what they're looking at. I think our community has not done the work that it needs to do and needs to do more of in terms of welcoming in new prospective buyers, collectors, future patrons, and so on and so forth. And at Art Basel, we're getting more and more precise about how we talk about this. It went from talking just about collectors and patrons to art lovers and buyers and audiences that may come and not necessarily collect, but they may spend money and buy, and that liquidity is really important. And I think more and more galleries, lever our platform again to create this sort of fleeting moment of needing to take action for their most important clients, but then casting a very, very wide net across other would-be, new collectors, new buyers that they can create touch points with. And that's all of that is what makes that, possible and important.
Hey everyone, taking another quick break here to tell you about our weekly newsletter, where I share a behind-the-scenes look into each time-sensitive episode, and where we also get into various things in the cultural sphere our team at The Slowdown is paying attention to. You can sign up and join our thousands of other subscribers by going to slowdown.media/newsletter. That's slowdown.media/newsletter. And now, back to the episode. Well, there's also, I guess, to use an overused term, it's the experience economy, right? And I think millennials and Gen Z are seeking experiences as much or even more so than previous generations. And part of it is that, I mean, it feels to me like the next generations value experiences more than stuff.
I mean, I think that this is overwrought to a degree. I'm talking about experience economy since I was a student.
It's in your book. There was a book you reference, Joseph Pine and John Gilmore, called The Experience Economy.
That was a really important book at the time. I haven't heard of it since then. I'm sure it's still important. Yeah. But I'll say this. It's been a challenging moment in the art market cycle. I think Basel, which performed really well in June, and it was also a wake-up call just after when Tim Blum closed his gallery and then Venus Over Manhattan shut and Olivier from Clearing also would announce his closure. And, you know, some people that are very close to the Art Basel family closed it down. And so I spent a lot of time this summer with Vincenzo De Bellis, our chief artistic officer and global director of the fairs, and our other fair directors, like really canvassing in very, very deep and measured way, like our clients. And I sat down with one of our most important gallery clients, and he said something to me that was a real eye-opener. He said, you know, no, Noah, like nobody comes to Art Basel anymore to be the first to buy something. They come because it fits their lifestyle. And that was a real eye-opener. And this is a gallery that, you know, does our fairs globally, leverages the platform, you know, arguably better than anybody else, or at least as good as anybody else. And, you know, even for him and his role to, you know, to really put his finger on it is a real wake-up call. And I think, of course, you know, there's a conceit there. Of course, collectors very much come to be the first to buy something. You know, but the moment of, you know, a collector putting on a fake mustache and, you know, finding like how to hack an exhibitor badge and sneak in an hour before the preview, you know, maybe is a bit of a thing of the past. But what's definitely not a thing of the past is, you know, the fact that, you know, a lifestyle around art and luxury and where you eat and where you sleep and where else you shop and what else you do outside of the hours that you're in an art fair is really important. And that's really important for Art Basel, but it's important for our industry as a whole, because I think, you know, and even for me running the Art Basel business, and, you know, here I've really learned a lot as a manager and as a CEO. Like, I'm intensely proud of what we do and believe that we are best in class. And I think, you know, in the halls of the fair, if you go gallery to gallery, like we are as good as it gets. And I think what visitors would have seen in Paris and what they're going to see in a few weeks in Miami is absolutely emblematic of that. Some of the greatest art in the world and then across all spectrums, and it's awesome. But there are things we can do better. We have to be better on our hospitality, on our VIP servicing. You know, we have to be better outside of the halls of the show. And if we start comping to other major global events, you know, and luxury offerings, right, the things that our clients have come to expect, you know, the bar is risen and risen and risen and risen. And I think that there is some, you know, significant room for improvement, even for Art Basel at the very top end of that. I think, you know, as a business, we're open about that, and we are, you know, calibrating in real time, and we're starting off a pretty extraordinary base, right? But we're cognizant that as a business that's looking to grow and evolve and continue to be best in class, not just for this moment, but for the next 50 years, putting the right fundamentals in place, bringing in insights, listening to people out of industry, really having our ear to the ground on a global basis, but through a much more striated, you know, customer base is really important. And I, as a CEO, spend less time, you know, in the back rooms of galleries talking about artistic programs. Like, we have an awesome team under Vincenzo that does that. And I do a lot of that still too. But looking at, you know, what we can do on our digital side, what we can do with marketing, what we can do with our content, the stories we can tell to engage audiences. You know, we've started doing more with the Art Basel shop and creating different touch points through those means. We've started this new digital initiative called 010, which I think is interesting.
That's going to launch at Miami, right?
It's going to launch in Miami, yeah. And it's a lean into the unknown at some level, right? Like, and it gets back to this fundamental, thing. And speaking of market cycles, like, it would be inarguable to me as a CEO of this business to not acknowledge that technology is going to play a huge role in shaping cultural production in the next years. There are, as a result of that, artists and cultural practitioners using that technology to make things and using those technological means to create different distribution mechanisms and different ways of creating touch points with communities. Also, like, and it's a conceptual art conceit, like the role of the audience, like Lawrence Weiner, like an artwork may or may not exist, right? And it's up to the receiver to figure out whether you bring it into being is much the same with a lot of this production. You see
Rick Ritt's work too.
Yeah. Rick Ritt's work, all of this work. Like it's an idea, but it only becomes art when certain engagements and certain ownership and agency is taken on board. And I think as we look at that through the lens of what's happening in this digital world, like, the boom bust of the NFT frenzy has happened, and I think that's in our rearview mirror. But something's definitely bubbling up there. And I think from an Art Basel leadership standpoint, we feel it's important to lean in and to figure out how to build bridges. Because fundamentally, Spencer, I have a fiduciary to deliver new audiences to our gallery clients and to the artists that are within the Art Basel umbrella, but also to further advance the kinds of art that are sitting in that realm and opportunities within that realm. There's a lot of artists that show in our galleries or show in museums that are experimenting with technology. It probably have hit certain barriers or walls in terms of how to fund these projects or how to gain access to this or that. Our other hope with 010 is that it creates a more fluid exchange between our existing artists and gallery audiences and new ones. And it's a bit of a lean into the unknown, but it's something that I think, it feels right. And it's something that we're excited about and will be fully behind in Miami and then heading into next year.
Well, it's exciting to see how it evolves or matures, I think was probably even a better word. I went back to this 2010 piece that Guy Trebay wrote in the New York Times about Art Basel Miami Beach. And in it, he asks, what is Art Basel Miami Beach precisely? Is it merely an art world trade fair, one of scores now scheduled in succession across the planet? Is it, like much else in Miami Beach, just another overhyped cross-platform marketing opportunity? Is it a pre-Christmas break for global billionaires? And it's funny because it's like at the time, those questions all felt very real. But now that it's 23 years old, it feels a little different. It feels like there's some sort of maturation is the word, like I've been going to the fair probably at least for 12 years or so. And in that time, I've seen it just go from being this very like hyped up festival to something that now seems, it's still Miami, but it seems like we're entering a new phase. Would you?
Yeah, 100%. And I think we've been in that new phase for some time now. So I think to Guy Trebay, it's all of those things, but it's also very real. I think one of the interesting outcomes in Miami culturally is that, first of all, there are, finally in the last years, a number of really progressive and interesting galleries locally that just weren't there in the beginning. In the beginning, there was Fred Snitzer, who was on the original committee. David Castillo came into the frame. And, now with Nina Johnson, Anthony Spinello, and, a number of others, Central Fine, like there's a great local ecosystem of interesting galleries. But Miami, through the private collections, through, Norman and Irma Brayman's patronage and the ICA, through Don and Mira and the Rebel collection, through Marty Margulies, through the Dela Cruzes, through Craig Robbins and all he's done in the design district. Like, Young arts, like, but also like the Bass and Jorge Perez and Darlene and the Perez Art Museum. Like there's a real ecosystem. And what that's created is a new generation of patronage. It's created new outlets for younger generations to be inspired by. Like we do a lot with local schools, which people probably don't recognize. And, we do a lot of that work Friday, Saturday, Sunday at the fair and bring these school groups in. And it's amazing to see the response. They have this moment where the eyes of the world are on their city and they get access to this thing. And that's really powerful. The other thing that's happened in Miami in the last, certainly in the post-COVID moment, is like, the bar has just gotten raised really high. The early days was this Miami Vice sort of moment and alchemy of things that was a bit seedy. I still will put my hand down that Max Deuce is one of the great bars the world over, but there's a lot more now than a dive bar and or nightclubs. Like there is awesome retail. I think what Craig's done in the design district, but also like, elsewhere and throughout, greater Miami is awesome. And it's raised the bar for what Miami can be. It is a city today that sees itself as a city of culture. People are proud of the fact that, Zaha spent a lot of time there. They're proud that, Herzog and Demeron, like Basel-based architects, did the extraordinary car park at 1111 Lincoln Road and so on and so forth. So it's a city that prides itself on culture. And that transformation is like, that's extraordinary. And we're very proud of having enabled that. Also, Spencer, and this is business talk, like Art Basel is an economic driver of the cities in which it occurs. We drive hundreds of millions of dollars of economic impact, money that wouldn't otherwise get spent during that week a year into the local economy to support businesses, in Miami Beach, but greater Miami. It's unparalleled. It's larger than the F1, right? Like that's an amazing thing. And our ability to do that, to make an impact in a city like Paris, like, this great, proud cultural city.
Yeah, it already has all the culture, right?
Has all the culture, but you feel the impact of Art Basel. And that is an impact of excellence. It's an impact of possibility. And that's something that we're very focused on. We were just in Tokyo last week for Art Week Tokyo, which is a new initiative that's not an Art Basel. It's not a full-blood Art Basel fair, but it's a week of activities and engagements, and we're working with the city and the local galleries and cultural community there to bring an Art Basel imprimatur to that week. And so there's just so much we can do as a brand. Now we have to really think very carefully about where we appear in the world. We need to make sure that we're not diluting the proposition and that we're always focused on delivering, at 10 out of 10 levels of excellence. But, we're very focused on this, and you see this in Miami as it's matured, and we're really proud of that. But you see it in Hong Kong similarly, like what Hong Kong has become as, that moment in the Asian cultural calendar, or what Basel still is, like in Basel, Switzerland, which is, it's such a unique opportunity for true connoisseurs. It's like art camp for adults, for that few days. And it's awesome. And there's really nothing else like it on the cultural calendar. And so, these are all things that we're very focused on and that, excite me as the person leading the business, but I know excite our team and the communities around Art Basel as well.
So to close, or I guess final question, say it's 2050. What's the legacy you hope to leave in all the work you're doing at Art Basel? Like what would be the sort of big picture, like Art Basel's become X?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, if I can leave a legacy where Art Basel is not just known as an art fair, but as a real catalyst for cultural advancement, that's an extraordinary legacy. It won't be my singular legacy. I'm just a guy that's very passionate, engaged, and occasionally good at my job. Because that's the Art Basel I know. The Art Basel I know is not just these weeks during the moment. It's an absolute year-round commitment to advancing cultural opportunity for an expanded cut of the world of art. And in saying the world of art, there's an intentionality. It's not just the art world, right? And to really moving that needle. When I was growing up and started pursuing things professionally, like being the director of a major museum was like the ultimate. Like that was Everest. And I'd like to think that for a younger generation working for an organization like Art Basel or being part of what we're building for a new generation, which has its foot in institutionality and curatorial and artistic excellence, but also in a world of high-paced business and innovation and entrepreneurialism, is also that and maybe even then some. And if that's a legacy I can leave, I'll be very proud of.
Could Art Basel one day have its own sort of in the ground brick and mortar, institution, museum?
Certainly could, Spencer. That would be the inversion of the paradigm, and I wouldn't rule it out. But it's also not the next thing we're looking to build. And I think there's a lot we've started in the last 24 months. I mean, I've been in this role for 3 years now, and we spoke a little bit about 010. We talk about Art Basel Awards, which is really important. Like, there's not a platform in our industry to truly recognize excellence, both on an artistic side, but also on the institutional side. If we look at the other things we're doing, I think that there's a lot of runway there, which can potentially include some physicality as well.
Noah, thanks for coming on today and entertaining all of my questions.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Extra thanks to our Season 12 presenting sponsor, the high jewelry maison Van Cleef & Arpels. Since its founding in Paris's Place Vendôme in 1906, Van Cleef & Arpels has developed a distinctive blend of poetry and refinement. With its jewelry and watchmaking collections, the Maison is an invitation to a timeless universe of beauty and harmony. You can discover more at vancleefarpels.com. That's VANCLEEFARPELS.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. To keep up with our latest time-sensitive episodes and get behind-the-scenes updates, sign up for our newsletter at slowdown.media/newsletter. That's slowdown.media/newsletter. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.media. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Olivia Almer, Mimi Hannon, and Johnny Simon.